Hi, Misha here, and this is my second video on armor, and it's on another Russian. Now, I'm not going to do these in historical or chronological order. I'm going to do them in the order however the hell I feel like. And mostly I'm going to be covering US and Russian armor because that's what interests me. And this one, who follows the main Mishaco channel, shouldn't be a surprise. We're going to look at the BMP series, the Armored Infantry Fighting Vehicle. Really the first infantry fighting vehicle to be mass-produced in the world. And we have all three versions here, BMP-1, BMP-2, and BMP-3. Now, I said in the main Mishaco channel video, I jokingly used other models from sci-fi, that I couldn't find the BMP-1 and the 2 in the USA. The only BMP-3 I could find was from Model Collect, which is fine. But no one else had these. But then I thought, why don't I check elsewhere? And I actually found these in Russia. Surprise, surprise. And these are, well, effectively Eagle Moss. They go under a different brand name in Russia, but they're Eagle Moss for all intents and purposes. So yeah, we're going to talk about this very cool historic video and, vehicle. Video, who cares? It's late. I'm tired. And look at the differences. Just have some fun with the really unique and useful craft in Russia. So here we have the original, on the spinny thing. Believe it or not, I actually ordered an actual model turntable, but I still probably use this cake thing because it's fun. Anyway, this is our first one. And it's a very interesting craft for its day and time. And this is actually an outgrowth of deep battle, a tactic that Russia flirted with on and off in the 30s and used in the 40s and World War II. And see, they did adopt APCs, armored personnel carriers, such as the BTR-40, BTR-50, and the BTR-152. But these were not really armored to speak of. In fact, a lot of them were still open top. And if they had guns, they were just defensive 7.62, maybe 12.7, or at most 14.5 millimeter defensive machine guns. Some were amphibious, many were not, yada yada. But times they were a-changin'. And after kind of finally ditching a lot of outdated battle tactics in the 1950s, the powers that be in the Soviet Union wanted the infantry to be more mobile. They wanted to be able to keep up with tanks. And they wanted them protected. And not just from shell fragments, artillery, machine guns, cannons. They were also increasingly worried about nuclear fallout, chemical, biological attacks. So that meant something sealed up. So even though they would adopt the BTR-60, which we will get to, APC, originally the P version was an open top because, in Russia, open tops are great. But they needed something that could get troops safely. Now, in the beginning, Russia used APCs as essentially taxis. They delivered troops to the front line, hopefully safely, and then they retreated. This seemed like a waste, so they wanted something that could combine APC with a light tank and able to fight other light tanks, light armor, also go on the attack with the infantry, and give covering fire to the infantry, the squad that would dismount, as it were. So there were a lot of requirements. And, oh yeah, let's make it amphibious too. Oh, and it needs to be pretty fast, because it's got to keep up with the modern tanks. Yeah, oh, and, aircraft defense, all that. Yeah, those are all things too. Pretty wide thing. In 1959 and 1960, the specifications were given to several design bureaus, including KMZ and the Volgograd tractor factory. Now, ultimately, KMGZ's Object 764 was selected for development, and the first prototype came out in '64. It wasn't perfect, so in '65, a new version was trialed at the beginning of that year and kind of lasting mostly through that year, at least until winter set in, known as the Object 765, and this was much better. After some field trials, it was put into limited production in 1966 and adopted as the BMP-1, Series 1. Now, the first 3 years were limited production, and full production started around 1969, 1970, and by this point, they kind of worked out a few bugs. They improved the transmission, they improved reliability, and this would actually be kind of a Series 2 version of this vehicle. Again, this was a very new concept. If you look at America's M113, Vietnam, or what Britain and Germany were up to, this really had features that they did not. But it was far from perfect, but still, it was revolutionary. As with most of my models, this is 1/72 scale die-cast. Like I said, it's Eagle Moss, so it's not expensive. It's not a high-end thing. A lot of these do have moving turrets, and they actually do have rubber tracks or moving wheels if it's a wheeled vehicle. This is a tracked vehicle, although in the beginning they weren't sure, wheeled or tracked. They actually tried both on paper, but they ended up going with tracks. Overall, this is about 22 feet long. It's a little under 10 feet wide, and it's actually very short. It has a very low silhouette, including this conical low profile turret. It's under 7 feet tall. And it's not exactly slow. It can get up to 40 miles per hour on road, nearly 30 miles per hour off-road, and it is amphibious, with very little, if any, prep. It's pretty slow in the water at 5 miles or less, assuming no current, and it is rated for not only small rivers, but also lakes, but not so much ocean. So yeah, let's be realistic. It is armored. The idea, they wanted to be able to defend against 23mm cannon rounds, as well as 50 caliber machine guns, fragments. The side armor is thinner, so it's only really good against small arms, but in the front, this can defend against 20 and 23mm shells, at least unless you're right up close. And the armor is anywhere, at its thinnest point, it's about 1/4 inch, to its thickest point in the front, it's over 1 1/4 inches. So that's kind of its general specs. What about being an APC, as it were? Well, we have theoretically a total of 11 can fit in here, but this was rarely, if ever, done. 8 to 9 tended to be the maximum squad. On the front, we have on the right side an engine. On the left, we have a driver. And behind him is the commander. Both of them have night vision periscopes. And in the turret, which is a one-person turret, we have the gunner, who also has night vision. And this can all be sealed up tight because, again, they were worried about nuclear, biological. So it had a pressure system to force out and could be sealed up pretty tight. In the back, we had a crew compartment for up to 8, 4 on each side, and they sit right down the middle, kind of back to back. And as is quite famously known, under them and on their backs was the main fuel tank. Yay! Also, if that's not enough fun, a lot of ammunition for their guns and the main gun was just kind of stored anywhere they could find place. They didn't really have armored lockers, vaults for the ammo. Yay! And if that's not enough, the back doors, they're our 2 back doors here. Also, there's a total of 4 hatches on the roof, you can kind of see. The back doors doubled as auxiliary fuel tanks. Yay! Now, it's not that bad. Actually, the back door tanks were rarely used, if ever, in combat. They were basically just transit tanks to get from point A to point B in a safe area. In combat, they actually intentionally drained these and often filled them with sand or other inert material to effectively provide protection. So it wasn't quite as nutty as you might first think. Now, another major requirement when they were designing this, the troops in the back had to be able to use their small arms to fire out the vehicle. They didn't want a situation where the troops had to dismount to work. Now, as it happened, that's actually kind of what ended up happening. But, they're still working out new doctrine, new theory for this newfangled motorized infantry squadron. So each of the guys in the back had a firing port, plus the commander had one. So we had a total of 9 firing hatches, firing ports with exhaust for the guns, yada yada. And if you'd like to hear more about the squadron and the dismount, I will refer you to the Mishaco channel video, because I really give a breakdown of how that all works. But as far as this, what about its guns, its armament? That's always kind of fun. Well, this was effectively meant to be a light tank, therefore we have a smooth bore, self-loading, semi-automatic, 73mm cannon. And it was meant to engage targets out to 700 meters. And on top of that, it carried 4 anti-tank wire-guided missiles. It could carry 5, but this was very rarely done because the 5th one actually had to be carried externally. Not a good idea. So, yeah. And on top of that, of course, we had a PKT machine gun mounted with about 2,000 rounds. Some sources say 2,100. So we have all that, plus what the crew were able to poke out the ports, and several hatches, like I said, all around. So it's a pretty nicely well-rounded vehicle. First introduced into Russian service in '66, the West got their first peek at the BMP-1 in November 1967 during a Moscow parade. It would have to wait a few years to first see combat, and it actually wouldn't be in Russian hands. They were already exporting these, and Egypt and Syria had the BMP in 1973 in October when the Yom Kippur War kicked off with Israel, and they used it quite extensively. Now, in the interim, like I said, 1969, kind of the first round of updates started. By 72-73, the next series of updates began. At this point, they were kind of improving the chassis, the engine, the transmission, and adding a little weight. She was getting a little chunky, about 500 pounds heavier. But it was actually thanks to the Yom Kippur War, as well as events in the Vietnam War, that really got the designers to figure out what worked and what didn't. And ultimately, they were going to make something improved. But in the interim, they wanted kind of a stopgap standard, something they could get into production quickly. And this would become the BMP-1P. Introduced in 1979, its major update was to the anti-tank missile system. The original ones didn't quite have the range or the power they were hoping for, but the improved version could get out to 4 kilometers, and it was just a little bit better. It wasn't perfect, but yeah, a little bit better. They also gave more protection against napalm, namely, with the new fire extinguisher system. Yeah, that would definitely be something they learned from the Vietnam War. They also gave protection against neutron radiation, neutron warfare, because, well, it's the 70s and times are moving on. So yeah, the BMP-1 had a BMP-1P, had other changes, and they were new production vehicles in 79 onwards, until production would end in 83. And a lot of the older ones were updated to this new standard, and there were a lot of them. Over 26,000 of this variant were built under license in Czechoslovakia, Romania, and actually India, of all places, and not under license in China is the Type 86. And these also, of course, would see tons of use in the Afghanistan war throughout. Many were pulled in for the update program throughout the 80s and refurbishment, and while many have been lost over the years, actually, the Russian army still has around 1,000 in its inventory, and many nations around the world still have these, again, being updated as needed. So they're still kicking about. But there are better things to come. Meet the BMP-2. And if you're wondering what these are, that's because this is actually a BMP-2D variant. Probably the most successful in the Afghan war. But this is essentially a heavily modified BMP-1. In fact, it's the same chassis. And the idea to have a next-generation vehicle here really was planted in 1972, but thankfully for them, the designers, the Yom Kippur War happened, and they were able to learn a lot of lessons. So when the program really got going in 1974, they integrated them. And like I said, the BMP-1P was a stopgap solution. There was also the BMP-1G, which was fitted with an automatic grenade launcher, because everyone knows from GoldenEye, those are cool. But ultimately, they worked on what became the BMP-2. First put into limited production in 1980 and very quickly rushed into Afghanistan. This hit full-rate production by 1982 and would be produced up until around 1989, at least full rate. And I don't really know how many were built. I apologize. Can't really find a firm number. Things get a little soft after the disillusionment of the Soviet Union. So what do we have here? Well, this is a heavier vehicle. I didn't mention it, but the BMP-1 over here was about 13.5 tons, give or take, which variant, sometimes version closer to 14. This was clearly heavier at 14.3, or even closer to 15 tons, at least for this variant here. So we had more armor. We had some new steel, new construction in the armor. We had an upgraded engine, though, to compensate. So really, its speed and all that were the same. And overall length was the same at a little over 22 feet. It is a little wider at just over 10 feet. And it is taller at 8 feet because the main thing is our new turret. This now houses a 30mm cannon. Now you would think the 73mm, well, bigger is better, right? Well, the problem, the BMP-1 was mostly designed to attack, go up against light armor, tanks, and the like. Well, in Afghanistan, they quickly realized that they was going up against anything but. It's going up against booby traps, mines, and of course ambushes by people, mostly. And most importantly, anti-tank armament. So that 73mm cannon wasn't terribly useful. And as I said earlier, they were hoping it was good out to about 700 meters, but in reality, it was only good to 500 or even less. And they also were having a lot of trouble with guiding the, what were effectively tow missiles in the original version, which was a one-person turret. So even though this is a smaller bore gun, it had dual belt automatic feed, held a lot more rounds, higher velocity, more accuracy. In fact, it was good out to 1,500 meters against lightish armor, or even 4,000 meters against unarmored targets. And it had more elevation, and thanks to that and the higher speed of the projectile, it actually could engage targets in the air, not so much aircraft, of course, like jets, but more like helicopters, out to about 2,000 meters. So it was a kind of a multi-purpose gun that actually did really well. It kept, of course, having anti-tank missiles, improved versions, and the grenade launcher would appear. We still have machine guns, the PKT. But yeah, the main difference was the upgrade of the armor and weapons. But there were other changes. Even though the overall length is the same, the crew compartment in the back, which was originally 8, 4 and 4, is now 6, 3 and 3, which meant that the hatches were reduced from 4 to 2, plus of course the back doors, and the firing slits were reduced from 8 to 6. So in theory, it held 2 fewer in the back here. But it still had the driver's position up front. It still had another position behind him for a 7th passenger. That used to be more or less where the commander was located. But now he sits up here in this nice turret with the gunner. And that's because they realized having the driver and the commander sitting right next to each other was really not good for survivability. And actually things would get even better with the BMP-2D here. So we had a theoretical maximum of 11 in the BMP-1, although in reality it was rarely, if ever, more than 9. For the BMP-2, we had a maximum of 10, but in reality it was rarely, if ever, more than 8. Again, these are fully equipped troops, you know, not a lot of less room. Still had the weird fuel tank situation going on, and what have you. Wasn't perfect, but it was an improvement. So like I said, this was used in Afghanistan, and one thing they found out they were very vulnerable to were landmines. And that's what these are here. These are landmine plows. Now, they could also be installed on the BMP-1, but they were more or less standard on the 2D. While not perfect, they helped a hell of a lot. They also added additional armor underneath to try to protect the driver, and they gave a little bit more armor protection in the turret on the 2D to protect the gunner and the commander there. And finally, they added this kind of armored steel skirt along the tracks here. And so quite a bit more armor, meaning the overall weight went over 15 tons. The only real trade-off, this was no longer amphibious. Couldn't go in the water. But guess what? In Afghanistan, that wasn't really an issue. Can't imagine why. But at any rate, these were used there. They were also exported some, but not near as much as the BMP-1. In fact, they hoped to replace the BMP-1 entirely with the BMP-2. That's why they took the BMP-1 out in 1983. But, of course, the Soviet Union fell. So, full-rate production would kind of taper off here. But these would be delivered in very small batches, on and off, actually up until 2005. So it's a little hard to know in total how many were made. It is worth pointing out that Russia lost over 1,300 APCs, or infantry fighting vehicle types, in the Afghanistan war. So even though they built in large numbers, the attrition rate was pretty high. Even though this was reasonably well armored, studies showed that 50 cals could penetrate from the sides. It wasn't good with shells, even in the front, over 20 or 23 millimeter at most. It was very vulnerable to rocket-propelled grenades. It was vulnerable to anti-tank. And like I said, it was also vulnerable to mines, although less so with the 2 than the 1. Basically, if it were hit, if it were punctured, it was a death trap because of the ammo being scattered about inside, because of the fuel tank location. yeah, you just better not be hit. So, yeah. But this new turret was a vast improvement. It really was. And so, it did work well for them. But there was still room for yet more improvement. The BMP-3, the ultimate and still current expression. In fact, this is one of, if not the most heavily armed and even armored infantry fighting vehicles in the world. And it actually dates back to 1975, and the object, what was it, 685, I believe? Anyway, it was a light tank design, or 665, I think. This actually led to the first infantry fighting vehicle, object 688, which evolved into the 688M. And that really, from the original light tank, took the chassis, the frame, and a new low-velocity, multi-use 100mm gun. Well, the 688M, after a couple of years of trials and testing, was accepted in 1987 as the BMP-3. And it was first shown off to the world in May during the Victory Day, the May Day parade in Russia. But of course, yeah, the Soviet Union wasn't long for this world, so rate production was quite low in the beginning. And nevertheless, they did have exporters, and it did see combat, and it did go into the Russian military. First combat for Russia was in Chechnya in 1995, and the UAE actually used this a bit in 2000 in Kosovo. So how does it differ from our BMP-1 and BMP-2? This is a whole new design, although it has a lot in common with them. It's a little bit longer at about 23.5 feet. It's about the same length, width at about 10.5 feet as the 2. And it's actually just a smidgen shorter because of the new turret. But it's a lot heavier. It's over 18.5 tons in its lightest configuration. But if you strap on a bunch of armor and bells and whistles, it quickly grows to over 22 tons. And it is reasonably well appointed inside, and a whole new layout. We have 3 people in the front. Now, the BMP-1 and the BMP-2 have their engine in the front. The BMP-3 actually has it in the back, under the crew compartment. Meaning in the front we have the driver, more or less center, and then we have the commander and a trooper doing double duty as a gunner in the front for a total of 3. We still have a 2-man turret, and we have a compartment for 5 troopers in the back. So theoretical total of 10, although rarely, if ever, were they full up. Kind of the same situation. We have a lot more armor. We have a new aluminium steel alloy armor that can better protect against 50 cal and even larger, even from the sides. But probably more importantly for mines and whatnot, we have a double armored bottom hull. Plus, again, the engine kind of acts as a bit of de facto armor as well. The new turret has more armor. In fact, they offer this with reactive armor, explosive reactive armor. And speaking of the turret, moving up here, we have that 100mm gun. It's considered a low velocity. It can fire either shells or anti-tank missiles out of the gun. The shells are effective out to 4 kilometers, and the missiles it fires are effective out to 6 kilometers. But that's a big gun. Maybe you need close in. Well, don't worry. We still have a 30mm autocannon with a bunch of ammo, improved from the BMP-2, mounted alongside it. And if that's not enough, we still have a PKT coaxial machine gun up here. And if that's not enough still, there's actually 2 more machine guns mounted in the bow of the hull here, manned by the troopers. Gotta have something to do when you're riding around, right? By the way, this is an infrared or search thing. You can see it on the one. It is very heavily armed with a lot of effective equipment, and they have continued to improve it. In 2005 and again in 2017, KMZ, sometimes written as KMT, offered a new fire control system, more automation, more computers, more cool stuff like that going on. Of course, it has the latest and greatest in protection and night vision capabilities, since the BMP was always night capable since the very first iterations. And in fact, even though this is heavier, thanks to a whole new different power plant and chassis, it's actually a little bit faster. It can get up to about 45 miles per hour on the road, about 30 miles per hour cross country, and swimming in the water, which yes, it can still do. It can actually get up to a smoking 6 miles per hour. But hey, it's about 1.5 miles faster than previous versions, so yeah, why not? And the BMP-3 in more recent times has led to the BMP-3M, a modernized version. And this really just incorporates a lot of the new technology. Now, one thing I'll say, the BMP-1 did not have stabilization for the turret. Kind of a little bit of a problem. The BMP-2 introduced basic stabilization on one axis. Originally, this was carried over to the 3, but with the 3M, we have a full 2-axis stabilization for the turret. And the manufacturer says, hey, this thing can shoot accurately any of its guns, any of its weapons, not just moving, but moving on road, moving on rough terrain, even heck, moving in the water. And unlike earlier ones, this has actually been tested in the ocean, although I wouldn't recommend trying to cross the Atlantic in it. By the way, these actually use their treads to go in the water, and they have bilge pumps and everything, so if they get shot, to get him with holes, they'll still be okay. And the Russian military has purchased well over 1,000 of these. In fact, production at this time is over 2,000 units, probably closer to 2,500 now. There was an order for a couple hundred back in 2015, another order for a couple hundred back in 2018, and most recently in 2020, 170 more were ordered. Now, there is a potential successor on the drawing boards, but who knows if and when it'll come into use in full production. So until that happens, this serves Russia and a couple of other customer states pretty darn well. It's been reasonably successful for a post-Cold War vehicle. It's still not without some of the flaws, but it is heavily armed, heavily armored, can carry up to 10 troops, and has modern communications and equipment and whatever have you. It's just a little bit heavier, a little bit bigger. Let's wrap things up. So here they are, all lined up. In a lot of ways. Still the same basic concept from 50 years ago. Like I said, I talk a lot about the squadrons that dismount from these. And real operations, there's usually 6 men early on, sometimes 7, or in special needs 7. Kind of interesting though, the crew was 3. The driver, the gunner, and the commander. But everyone pretty much did double duty. The commander, for example, would dismount, and he would become the squadron commander, leader. Typically, he was a sergeant. In his absence in the vehicle, the gunner would take over as assistant leader, commander, until he got back. So, gunner did double duty as commander and gunner, because the vehicle would still very much operate. It would give suppressing fire, supporting fire, and it was also designed to kind of keep up with tanks and do its thing. And in fact, the infantry were not supposed to stray more than 800 meters from their vehicle, although in reality this, The driver also had double duty. He was the mechanic. Now, the dismount squad, again typically 6, would further split up into the fire squad and the maneuver squad, or I should say team or unit. The maneuver team was just 2, the senior rifleman and usually a supporting rifleman, although sometimes he was a DMR man armed with an SVD. And of course they would maneuver around, and they would be supported and covered by the main group, commanded by the commander, because he commands. He was supported by the machine gunner and the assistant machine gunner / rifleman, and the grenadier, who actually had an RPG-7. And sometimes there would be a second machine gunner, another rifleman, or a specialist like a medic. But often, especially later on, not so much. So yeah, it would actually kind of break down into 3 subgroups, and it would all, in theory at least, work together as a unit. And when the crew are mounted in the BMP, it would travel alongside the main battle tanks and support them as needed, hopefully keeping its cargo safe. All in all, just interesting doctrine, and really led the way forward. Again, not perfect, but what in this world is? Even our M2 Bradley is not without its issues, as is the British MC-80 Warrior. Yeah, this is why I kind of wanted to start the first major armor vehicle with these, because I find them very interesting. I like infantry vehicles, and they try to do so many things, and frankly, they really manage to do most of them very well. And again, at first I could only find the BMP-3 here from Model Collect. It's a nice model, but because of all the detailing, it's relatively light and die-cast. A lot of plastic on it when needed. It does have a moving turret, although mine's very loose. It does have rubber tracks. I think I was pointing at the wrong one. Sorry I was, but you know what I meant over here. This one. But when I found these couple in Russia, I definitely picked them up. And again, from Eagle Moss, you kind of know what you're going to get, good or bad. And for the money, they're pretty inexpensive. You get, like I said, a moving turret. And these are pretty heavy. They don't really come with any stand or anything. Now in Russia, they also came with an accompanying partwork magazine, but usually when they get imported to the US, for whatever reason, they don't have this. Maybe a publishing, probably a copyright thing, if I were to guess. I don't care. I was just happy to pick them up. And again, they were like 10, 11 bucks, so I'm not complaining. Just happy to have some BMPs. Everyone needs some BMPs in their lives. So what do you think? Which one is your favorite? Or maybe you don't like the BMP. Maybe you're a Bradley fan. If so, let's talk about infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, light tanks, whatever the hell we feel like in the comments. As always, I greatly appreciate you tuning in. If you could, please like, share, subscribe. And next time, we will get to these guys. Just a couple I've got on the table at the moment. Because it didn't just end with the BMP. Oh, no, no, no. We gotta drop this shit out of an airplane. Next time, we'll talk about the BMD. But until then, this is Misha.